This is apropos. Well, it comes at a time of growing challenges and uncertainty, including a persistently sluggish economy, foreign restrictions on its access to technologies, and high tariffs imposed on its exports to the United States. China's financial woes continue, with news that its economic growth slipped below 5% in the third quarter of this year. Well, this as President Xi Jinping opened a major meeting of the ruling Communist Party, where delegates are set to rubber stamp a draft plan laying out Beijing's goals for the next 5 years. Charlotte Lamb has more.
In Beijing, power gathers behind the red flag. It's plenum week when Chinese leaders chart the nation's next chapter. This one will define the 5-year plan, taking China to 2030. It's been nearly half a century since China began its transformation, a process party officials often trace back to December 1978, when economic reforms first opened the door to global trade and private enterprise. From rigid state-controlled planning to rapid industrialization, China quickly became the workshop of the world. Western manufacturing jobs flowed east, and the momentum surged again when it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Today, Beijing dominates renewable energy, electric vehicles, and rare earth metals needed to power them. In this new era, President Xi Jinping's focus is on innovation, with homegrown giants like TikTok, Huawei, and the AI powerhouse DeepSeek, showcasing how far the country's tech ambitions have come. But the rise is also fueling new tensions. Western governments increasingly see Beijing's advances as a challenge to their national security, and these talks unfold amid an ongoing trade rivalry with the US. The details of the new plan won't be revealed until next year, but all eyes are on Beijing this week for clues. Officials are expected to drop hints as early as Wednesday.
Well, to discuss, let's bring in Rana Mitter, ST Lead Chair in US-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Thanks, Rana, for being with us on the programme. Firstly, how significant are these 5-year plans that we see being rolled out by Beijing? And what have we learned today about China's main goals and aspirations for the rest of this decade?
They are important, I think, Sharon. They're not important in the way that they were, say, 50 to 70 years ago, when China had an economy a bit like the old Soviet Union, command economy from the top down. And in those days, the 5-year plan really would be a quite detailed plan about how much coal and iron and steel and so forth would be produced. That's not the case today. China has a market economy which is controlled in a broad sense by the state, but not in individual terms. But what it does indicate is where there is an emphasis in terms of where China wants to go next. And what we've seen so far, what we've learned, is that high tech is really at the heart of this. Producing green energy, producing the kind of technological progress that will enable China to become a winner in areas like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and also in general to run faster than the United States in terms of the global tech competition. That, I think, is really what's being indicated with this 5-year plan. And of course, China's private industries, although they are private, will be pushed in the direction of making sure that China as a whole goes in the direction that the ruling party, the Communist Party, wants it to go.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, who exactly approves this plan, or is it essentially just imposed by the Communist Party?
It is imposed by the Communist Party, but within the party there are quite considerable debates, although they are behind the scenes. Unlike in Washington or Brussels, you don't tend to get leaks to the newspapers about what's going on. One of the key organizations is the NDRC, National Development Research Council, which is basically economists, planners, thinkers who get around tables and have, from what we can gather, pretty fierce debates about what's the right mixture of production, consumption, investment, foreign direct investment, international investment, and so forth, that will bring about the kind of advanced economy that China wants to have, as well as thinking about things like growth rates. And China's just posted a growth rate a little bit below 5%. It would have ideally wanted 5%. It's a bit lower than that. But the NDRC, the Communist Party's organization in charge of economics, will play some significant role, I think, in setting those targets. And then they're produced top down by the party congress that you see in those pictures there, with no argument really allowed.
And what are the main challenges then for the Chinese economy? Despite slipping, below 5%, is it kind of performing well overall?
It's partially going well. Some areas of real concern include the real estate market. For about 15 years after the great financial crisis, China pumped a lot into building apartments, offices, and so forth, and that market collapsed a few years ago. It's being held up, but really only by state subsidies. So the question of where the next boom is going to come from, now that China's no longer, building high-speed rail and airports and apartment blocks in the same sort of way, that's a big question. At the same time, there is a feeling that some of these new technology opportunities have produced a lot of growth in places like Hangzhou on the East Coast, where Alibaba, one of the biggest retail companies, online companies in the world, is headquartered, or South China, which borders on Hong Kong, obviously a relatively rich area of China, or indeed Beijing, where there's a lot of technological innovation. The problem comes out in the countryside and also in the western part of China, which is much more remote and less economically enabled. So a bit like the United States, a bit like parts of Europe, you could say that China has a real regional problem. The rich bits are still pretty rich. The poor bits don't obviously show how they're going to get richer than their current relatively impoverished state.
So it's a bit of a mixed picture then. How tightly controlled would you say the Chinese economy actually is then? How innovative can it be if it is being tightly controlled by the government?
I wouldn't say, Sharon, it's being tightly controlled. I would say it's being directed from above. And in terms of the private sector in technology, big companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu actually have pretty fierce competition with each other within the huge internal Chinese market, bearing in mind that it's the biggest, along with India, the biggest single market in the world, much, much bigger in terms of consumers than Europe, for instance. But at the same time, there are some sectors of the Chinese economy that are controlled by the state, the so-called SOEs, state-owned enterprises. A lot of those in areas like energy, coal, steel, and those are not very economically viable in terms of the market. They're mainly kept for national security reasons. Even in Europe these days, of course, people are thinking about whether or not steel production should be kept at home. But the fact is that those industries have to be subsidized. They're often very bad for climate change, and China knows that it has to reform them. But it's one of those tasks that everyone knows is coming along one day, but people try and kick that particular economic can along the road for as long as possible.
And what kind of a shadow is Donald Trump playing over all of this? He announced earlier that he's going to be visiting China actually early next year. What kind of impact is his trade war having? These ongoing threats about tariffs, that must be playing into what Chinese leaders are preparing for when they're putting together a plan like this. Or can you even put a plan together with, with the unpredictability of Donald Trump?
Well, I think that China's begun to sort of bake that unpredictability in a sense. And actually, in a more low-key way, there was a meeting in Madrid just a couple of weeks ago where the US and China did thrash out certain kind of ground rules in terms of where they'll go next. I think that the current threats in the last, week or so of China threatening not to allow rare earths to be sold to America and America threatening to put yet more tariffs on China, both sides said they were going to give it about 30 days before they actually implemented these measures. And of course, pretty soon, Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are likely to meet in Seoul, Korea at the APEC meeting. So I think a lot of this actually is rhetoric on both sides. I would expect we'll see a meeting in November. Then probably a visit by Donald Trump to China in spring of next year. And I suspect at that point, a lot of these trade questions will be sorted out because both sides essentially want to maintain their particular areas of economic dominance. They are in competition, but neither side really thinks they can actually knock the other one out of the market. And so in the end, both sides, I think, will end up with some sort of compromise.
And what impact, Rana, do these Chinese five-year plans have on the global economy? Some experts pointing out that they've actually dramatically reshaped the economy right around the world, previous plans that have been rolled out by Beijing.
They really have. I mean, back in the 1980s, nearly 40, 50 years ago, we're talking about Chinese production, producing huge numbers of consumer goods being sold in the Western world, particularly at a time when the United States and Europe were basically creating debt to be able to buy Chinese goods. Or 15 years ago, in the aftermath of the great financial crisis of 2008, it was Chinese growth and that building boom that I talked about in the early 2000s and 2010s that really pushed a lot of global production. Think about all the steel, aluminium, concrete, which had to be produced in China and led to a kind of huge international level of demand. The issue is, of course, that no country in the world at the moment seems to be producing quite that level of demand. We seem to be in a much more uncertain period economically. So whether this 5-year plan is really going to produce the kind of production and consumption that China talks about, I think is much less certain than it was 15 or indeed 50 years ago.
And Ron, how are these plans viewed by the Chinese public, or does that depend on whether or not they live in those richer areas that you mentioned, or in, more poverty-stricken areas, more rural areas? Do they feel that they actually have any impact when it comes to what the government is actually planning for the whole country?
My general sense is that, people in their everyday lives don't think about the plans that much, partly because actually plan is a bit of a misnomer. It's really more of a framework or a kind of, way of thinking about the bigger picture. What they do notice is the effects. So, for instance, the rapid changing of Chinese society through artificial intelligence is, in a sense, a product of those 5-year plans. In other words, the ability of private companies to invest in AI, but under state direction. And that's going to keep on going in areas like retail and production. AI will continue to grow the already massive role that it has in Chinese society. And people will see the effects of that, particularly in areas like retail, for instance. I think also they'll notice that the state says that they want to increase consumption. China has had a problem for decades in not having enough domestic consumption, which would really drive growth. That's partly because people are worried about the fact that China doesn't have a good healthcare system, doesn't have a good welfare system. Its pension system is quite rickety. And that means that if people are being encouraged to spend more on consumption, then the state's going to have to step up and do more to actually improve those areas like healthcare. So they may take this 5-year plan as an indication that if they're being directed to consume more, the state may do more to kind of deal with problems of old age, which of course is central to a China that is demographically actually aging very fast because of the famous one-child policy. That policy came to an end about 10 years ago, but that generation of people who are getting older faster in China and the steady reduction in working age people in China is beginning to have an effect on the economy as well. And you can see that in the many one-child families that live in those apartments in China that are maybe reluctant to spend in those consumer markets, even though the government really wants them to do that and boost growth.
Rana Mitter, ST Lead Chair in US Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme this evening.